just to kind of give you a different perspective of what the San Juans used to be. And it's an archipelago. It's one of the few counties in the United States that consists entirely of islands. I think there's only 2 or 3 really in the U.S. that consist entirely of islands. 476 at low tide and about 170 something at high tide. And so here's Washington State. And in describing this, I want to say that, I grew up in New Jersey. Nobody's perfect. And New Jersey's about 1/10 the size of Washington State in terms of area. It's bigger than Washington State in terms of population. It's about 20% bigger in population. But what grips Washingtonians, especially urban Washingtonians, is the fear of growth. And it's a false fear, but it's a fear of growth. So Washingtonians are desperately afraid of growth. And this just kind of shows where I live relative to Washington State. So Washington State's in the far northwest part of the country, and then in the far northwest part of Washington State are the San Juan Islands, and that's where they are. It's stuck between Vancouver and Seattle, and Victoria's there. It's a great location. I mean, it's really between some of the 2 most high-tech, sort of vibrant cities in the continent, and you'd think it'd be a fantastic place for growth and for economic development. This red circle here I want to put there because Washington's a lot like Illinois or New York in that it's dominated by one metropolitan area. So more people live in Washington State within that red circle than live outside of it, and so it's the people within that red circle that sort of impose their will on the rest of the state. So within that red circle, there's a kind of a predominant philosophy, and the name I use for it is green reaperism, or sort of ecomorbidity. It's this belief that everything is always getting worse. It's terrible, and growth is bad. And if you listen to Hans Rosling, I'm not sure if people know who he is, but he's a Swedish statistician. He says that's one of the greatest misconceptions about the world. Things aren't getting worse. They're actually getting better in a human development index point of view. So in 1990, Washington put in the Growth Management Act because of this fear of growth. And its goal was to limit out-of-control growth. And really what was out of control was the projections about growth, not growth itself. Its effect on the rural areas of Washington, which really comprises most of the state, when you take away everybody, when you sort of discount the fact that most people live in that red circle, the rest of the state is pretty much rural. It just really hurt the rest of the state. Even though Seattle, for instance, is growing by 60,000 people a year, which is 4 times the population of our entire county, the people who pay the price for that growth are the rural areas, not the urban areas. So San Juan County, the effect of growth management and the Growth Management Act on San Juan County, where I live, is that immediately it took 10,000 development rights away. It's about 40% of all our development rights. And it all but eliminated guest house eligibility. Now, guest houses were an extremely contentious topic in our county because people love them. There was even a sort of advisory referendum about them, and everybody in the county wanted them. I mean, 80%. It was one of the highest percentages ever, and yet they still took them away. And it really affected affordability. It affected the ability of people to age in place because they couldn't have their family come and live with them while they aged. And it affected a lot of different things.
Can you explain that a little bit? What is that about?
So many of the parcels in our county are pretty large, and so they can easily fit more than one residence. And aside from having a main house, there was the eligibility to put in what's called an accessory dwelling unit, which is, 1,000 square feet basically in footprint. It can be 2 levels and things like that, but a smaller sort of cottagey kind of guest house. And it was an important component of our housing situation in the county, an important component of what people use to sort of plan the future of being in a remote area. And they took that away. But after they downzoned us, and after they took away guest house eligibility, another constraint that the Growth Management Act puts on us is this thing associated with critical areas. And CAO stands for the Critical Areas Ordinances. And it's a series of protections that are put on your parcels after they've done these other things, which make it extremely difficult for you to develop your land. So I'm going to show you the kind of effect that those ordinances had on the remaining development rights in our county. So this is a map of the county and the different islands. So these are the various islands in the county. That's where I live. And let's just walk through this. Those are the number of parcels in our county. There's about 17,000 parcels. And we have more shoreline in our county, you know, as a percentage of our overall area than anywhere else. We've got 400 miles of shoreline. And so one of the things that the critical areas requires you to protect is shorelines. So all those shorelines have to be protected and all the parcels associated with those shorelines. So those are all the parcels associated with those shorelines. Now, the thing that I'm trying to get across to you is that there's layer upon layer upon layer of regulation put on these remaining parcels that can be developed. And if you are going to develop them, you have to get consultants and all sorts of people and approvals to help you develop them. And so it's thousands and thousands of dollars you have to put up front now for studies of habitat and geology and everything else. So that's what you're going to see build up. So we've got shorelines and all the shoreline parcels affected. And that's roughly how much it affects just shoreline. So about 34% of our area is affected by shorelines, or the parcels representing it. And then there's geohazards, which for the most part in our area means cliffs. And there's duplicity because a lot of our shoreline areas are also bluffs, they're cliffs. And so these geohazards also play into this critical areas. And the parcels that are affected by them, this just kind of shows that you can even see the outline of the county still, just because most of the shoreline happens to be cliffs anyway, so you can still kind of see the outline of the shoreline. And those are the parcels affected by geohazards. Now, in addition to these actual areas that have to be protected, the Growth Management Act and the Critical Areas Ordinance puts buffers around things. So not just the thing is protected, but there are buffers around them, and these buffers can be huge. But you know, if you, this is just kind of a quick little scenario. You don't need much of a buffer around something to actually equal the area that's protected itself. And this is an example where you just put a 30-foot buffer on something, and you've actually doubled the size of it. And for many of the things that have to be protected in San Juan County, the buffers are hundreds of feet big. They're enormous. And one of the things where buffers are placed on more than anything else is wetlands, or supposed wetlands. So this is a map of all the suspected wetlands in the county. And that's all the parcels that are affected by wetlands. And that's how much area is affected. And streams. And they identify every little gully in the whole friggin' world as a stream. You know? And that's an argument in and of itself, because each one of these points can be argued in and of themselves about whether that's a wetland or whether it's not, and that's more money and more time. And those are all the parcels affected by streams. Right? So when you recap, right, when you take all the shorelines, and we take the geohazards, when you take the wetlands, and when you take the streams and you add all the parcels that are affected by them, that's what it comes out to be. And then on top of that, we protect land in San Juan County because we have national parks, and we have state parks, and we have all sorts of things as well, right? So those are all the CAO affected parcels, if you sort of just look at the parcels. And then those are the protected areas. Those are areas that are national parks and state parks and everything else. And then we have one sort of pseudo-urban area, town of Friday Harbor. Most places wouldn't call it an urban area. It's just a little village. But it's really kind of excluded from the CAOs itself. That's sort of the one place that has some reasonable regulation. But if you look at places outside of Friday Harbor, then those are the few remaining unaffected parcels in the county. And up there in the top left, it shows how many are how much is unaffected. So about 9% of our total area is really unaffected by all this regulation. It amounts to about, a third of the parcels, and they're very small parcels, obviously. And so, obviously, this affects affordability. When you basically have a very hard time coming up with pieces of property that don't need tremendous studies on them, and a lot of the land, there's still probably about 50% of our land which is raw land, and so you would have to get financing to build, perhaps, but you can't get financing for these consultant studies and things like that. The bank won't front you the money for that. So you have to put out tens of thousands of dollars to get these studies done before you can get the permit, before you can do building, and it really affects affordability. And so the net result is that all these efforts to protect, all these sort of progressive efforts to protect everything are really extremely regressive, very regressive. I don't know if you call them taxes, but they basically have the same effect as a regressive tax. They make housing and land development really expensive. And it also makes it very hard for people to start businesses. Even farming is difficult to do. And so you get this double whammy of expenses going up at the same time that good-paying jobs are disappearing. And the two biggest employment sectors we have are hospitality, as you might expect, and government. And hospitality is our biggest when it comes to numbers of employment, numbers of people. But government is our biggest when it comes to money, because government jobs are high paid. And so people who work for the county, people who work for state parks, or people who work for some of the other government entities are relatively high paid compared to everybody else. And this sets up a situation where the government employees and the high paid people who kind of want government policies vote to put in more government policies. We have the lowest labor participation in the state. Most of our working people work 2 or 3 jobs, and we have a lot of retired people and a lot of people who come there and basically love transfer payments. So we have a bimodal distribution. Again, bring up Hans Rosling. He likes to mention that the idea that there's income inequality throughout the world and it's getting worse is a false idea. Most people are in the middle. San Juan County is working the exact opposite way. We're actually going against the global trend. So we have a bimodal distribution. Our 2 peaks are in the 10 to 14 range and in the 60 to 64 range in terms of age. And it's not an equal hump. The 60 to 64 is much bigger than the 10 to 14. And what we're missing, when you look at the inequality data and when you look at the age data, we're missing that group in the middle, that group from basically 25 to 35, that is your middle working class. We don't have one. So, looking at what's happened to San Juan County, many of these progressive ideals and progressive policies have just destroyed the place. They're regressive, and they really hurt not just poor people, but working middle-class people. And these government jobs that pay well tend to breed a voting population that just wants more government jobs. The affordability is being discussed in San Juan County again, and it gets discussed from time to time. But the solutions aren't easing up on the land use regulations. The solutions are putting in a new taxing district to create an agency or to fund people who will build single residence affordable housing, which is probably the most expensive way to build affordable housing that there is. Because to build affordable housing, you really got to get away from the cost of land, especially in a place where land is 4 times more expensive than the rest of the state. So every solution breeds another problem. And I showed you all those beautiful pictures in the beginning. And this is what San Juan County used to look like. And it looks horrible to environmentalists and things like that. But one of my favorite experiences is one of my friends comes from a family that's been in San Juan County for a long time. And he comes from a logging family. And some new resident will come to San Juan County and explain that some point or some field or some whatever is just pristine and beautiful, and God, we need to preserve it. And my friend will say, oh yeah, my dad and I, we clear cut that whole place in 1968. And so this idea that sort of nature is fragile and it can't come back is really a false premise. And it's the premise, though, that's used to base a lot of these protection measures that really just destroy communities. Nature's much more resilient than what people give it to be. Anyway, so this is what San Juan County used to look like when it was working and had a middle class. And I think that's about it. Anyway, questions?
Well, we'll do the